The ancient stone walls of Kerry held secrets that would forever change my understanding of what lies between the world of the living and the dead. In 1976, at the tender age of 6, my family uprooted our lives from the bustling concrete jungle of New York City to the misty fields of County Kerry, Ireland. The transition from skyscrapers to weathered stone wasn't just a change of scenery. It was stepping into a world where reality and folklore danced an eternal waltz in the shadows. Our new home, a 2-story farmhouse built in 1937, stood proudly against the grey Irish sky, its weathered stones holding nearly 2 centuries of my family's history. The structure had been built atop the bones of an old cottage, as if the past refused to be entirely buried. My grandmother Mary, a woman whose silver hair seemed to catch moonlight even in darkness, had moved into this house as a young bride when she married my grandfather Dan. But it wasn't just a house she inherited. It was a treasury of tales that would eventually seep into my young bones. Mary wasn't just my grandmother. She was a keeper of ancient traditions, a masterful storyteller who wielded words like a painter uses brush strokes. Despite my mother's protests, she would gather us children close when shadows grew long, her voice dropping to a whisper that seemed to make the very air tremble. Her stories weren't mere entertainment. They were portals to a darker Ireland, one where the veil between worlds was thin as morning mist. "Listen close," she'd say, her eyes reflecting the firelight like polished copper pennies. "The fairies aren't like those pretty things in your American books. They're the old ones, the ones who demand respect." Her words would weave tales of unbaptized babies whose cries could still be heard along the unconsecrated field's edge, their tiny souls trapped between worlds. She spoke of the black hound that stalked Ellis's wood, its eyes burning like embers in the darkness, and of phantom hitchhikers who would vanish from moving cars, leaving nothing but the lingering scent of peat smoke. The farmhouse itself was a character in her stories, but unlike her other tales, these weren't legends passed down. They were experiences etched into the very foundation of our home. The front door, a massive oak barrier that had witnessed more endings than beginnings, held particular significance. In the years before nursing homes became common, our farmhouse had served as both cradle and coffin for generations of my family. 14 bodies, their souls prepared for the next world through traditional Irish wakes, had passed through that door in barely more than a decade. Each time Mary spoke of the door, her voice would take on a different quality, less the dramatic flair of a storyteller and more the hushed reverence of a witness. "The front door," she'd say, "it knows its purpose. According to tradition, it would only open for life's most sacred moments, funerals carrying souls to their rest, weddings welcoming new life into the family, and the Stations of the Cross, blessing the home with divine protection." But as the modern world crept closer and traditions began to fade like old photographs, the door fell into disuse. The damp Irish climate caused the wood to swell and seal as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. When we arrived from New York, it took the strength of 2 men to force it open, the ancient hinges protesting with a scream that echoed through the empty rooms above. That sound, like the wail of a banshee, seemed to awaken something in the house, something that had been waiting, watching, remembering. As I stood there in the doorway, my small hand pressed against the rough stone wall, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Kerry wind. It was as if the house itself was sizing me up, deciding whether I was worthy of its secrets. Little did I know then, but that moment marked the beginning of my own chapter in the house's long story. A chapter filled with unexplained footsteps. In the night, shadows that moved against the light, and the weight of hundreds of years of history pressing down on my young shoulders. The farmhouse had welcomed me home, but home, I would learn, meant something very different in this corner of Ireland, where the past never truly dies. It just waits for the right moment to walk again. The years that followed our arrival unfolded like pages in one of Grandmother Mary's spectral tales. As summer faded into autumn, and autumn surrendered to the grey Irish winters, the farmhouse revealed its peculiarities, one creaking floorboard at a time. The back door leading to the farmyard remained our primary entrance, a practical portal to the world of the living. But it was the front door, that supposedly sealed barrier, that became the focal point of our family's most unsettling experiences. Late at night, when the wind whistled through the gaps in the ancient stonework and the darkness pressed against the windows like a living thing, my grandparents would hear it. The sound would start with a distinct click, the heavy latch lifting as if guided by an invisible hand. The door that was sealed shut by decades of dampness would swing open with the confidence of a regular visitor. The footsteps always follow. The same path, my grandmother would say, her voice barely above a whisper, as if the very walls were listening. Up the stairs they go, slow and deliberate, like someone checking on their sleeping children. She would describe how she and my grandfather would lie perfectly still in their bed, listening as the unseen visitor made their methodical journey through each of the 5 bedrooms overhead. The footsteps weren't those of a stranger, she insisted. They carried the weight of familiarity, the measured pace of someone who knew every loose floorboard, every creaking joist. "They sound like they belong here," she'd say, her eyes distant with memory, like they're making sure everything's as it should be. I remember the first time I stayed in one of those upstairs bedrooms. The room itself was a testament to generations past. Layers of wallpaper peeling at the corners revealed patterns from different decades, each telling its own story. The heavy wooden furniture seemed to absorb shadows rather than cast them, and the mirror above the dresser reflected more than just the physical world, or so it seemed to my young mind. That night, as I lay in the bed that had held so many before me, I felt it, the sensation that would become as familiar as my own heartbeat. It started as a prickling at the base of my neck, a feeling of being observed by eyes I couldn't see. The air would grow thick, as if the past was pressing in from all sides. The temperature would drop subtly, not the brutal cold of winter, but the cool touch of memory. During the day, I began to notice other things. The house had its own language, a creak here, a tap there, but it was more than just the settling of an old building. Sometimes, when I was alone in a room, I would catch movement in my peripheral vision, like someone passing by in a hurry. Other times, objects would appear in places where they hadn't been moments before. A book moved from shelf to table, a chair slightly askew, as if recently vacated. The layers of history in the house were physical as well as spiritual. The wallpaper, applied generation after generation, had become a palimpsest of family life. Each layer held the echoes of conversations, the lingering warmth of celebrations, the heavy silence of wakes. When my grandmother would run her hand along the walls, it was as if she was reading Braille, each bump and imperfection telling her a story from the past. My grandfather Dan was a different sort of keeper of history. While Mary dealt in tales of the supernatural, he carried the weight of earthly secrets. The guns hidden in the walls weren't just weapons. They were artifacts of a time when Ireland's struggle for independence turned farmers into fighters. I would catch him sometimes standing in front of the front door, lost in thought. What memories played behind his eyes? How many times had he opened that door in the dead of night to receive or deliver messages that could change the course of history? The house itself seemed to respond differently to each person who lived within its walls. To my mother, it was a place of childhood memories tinged with both warmth and wariness. To my grandmother, it was a repository of stories and spirits. To my grandfather, it was a keeper of secrets that would never be fully revealed. But to me, it became something else entirely. As I grew older, I began to understand that the line between the natural and supernatural wasn't as clear as I had been taught in my American schools. The footsteps that echoed through the house at night, the sensation of being watched, the unexplained movements, these weren't just ghost stories to frighten children. They were the house's way of remembering, of keeping alive the souls who had passed through its doors. The true nature of our farmhouse's mysteries crystallized during its renovation, years after my grandparents had passed. The autumn air was thick with dust and memories as workers began stripping away the layers of the house's history. Each wall that fell, each floorboard that was pried up, revealed another chapter of our family's story, and something more. The first discovery came on a Tuesday morning when the weak Irish sun barely penetrated the scaffold-covered windows. A worker's crowbar had caught on something metallic behind a section of wall in what had been my grandfather's study. The sound of crumbling plaster was followed by a collective gasp. There, nestled in a cavity that had remained untouched for decades, lay several rifles wrapped in oil-soaked cloth, remnants of the Irish Republican Army's struggle for independence. But it wasn't just weapons the walls had been hiding. As the renovation continued, other items emerged from their decades-long slumber. Letters yellowed with age, their ink faded but still legible, detailing operations and safe houses. Photographs of stern-faced men standing in front of the very same front door that had featured in so many of our family's supernatural encounters. And most haunting of all, a small leather-bound diary with my grandfather's precise handwriting, documenting the comings and goings of those who had used our home as a waypoint in their fight for freedom. The discoveries continued as workers moved upstairs. Beneath the floorboards of the 5 bedrooms, the same ones visited by our nighttime walker, they found more. Religious medals, prayer cards, and small personal effects that had belonged to those who had died within these walls. Each item seemed to pulse with its own energy, as if the memories attached to them were trying to break free. It was during this time that the footsteps became more frequent, more insistent. No longer confined to the dead of night, they would echo through the partially demolished house even in broad daylight. Workers reported tools moving on their own, doors closing without a draft, and the persistent feeling of being watched. One worker refused to return after claiming he saw a figure in old-fashioned clothing standing at the top of the stairs, only to vanish when approached. The renovation reached its crescendo on a storm-laden evening when the workers had gone home. I had stayed behind, drawn by some inexplicable need to be there alone among the exposed beams and stripped walls. The front door, temporarily removed from its hinges, leaned against the wall nearby. Thunder rolled across the Kerry Hills as I stood in what remained of the entrance hall, surrounded by the physical evidence of our family's secrets. That's when it happened. The temperature dropped suddenly, dramatically, my breath visible in the air. The sensation of being watched, always present in the house, intensified until it felt like a physical weight. And then, clear as day, I heard them, the footsteps, but this time, they weren't muffled by walls and floorboards. They were right there, invisible yet undeniable, moving past me with purpose. As the unseen presence moved up the stairs, I found myself following, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't explain. Each step seemed to creak in recognition, and the feeling that had terrified me as a child now felt almost welcoming. When I reached the top of the stairs, the footsteps led me through each bedroom in turn, and in each one, memories flooded back. Not just my own, but somehow others as well. In one room, I could almost see my grandfather as a young man, hiding weapons and documents in the walls. In another, I felt the weight of grief from the 14 wakes that had been held here. The footsteps finally led me to what had been my grandparents' room, where they had lain awake so many nights, listening to these very same sounds. Standing there, surrounded by the exposed skeleton of our family home, I finally understood. The footsteps weren't a haunting in the traditional sense. They were a guardian, a keeper of secrets and stories, making their rounds just as my grandfather had done during the Troubles, just as my grandmother had done caring for the dying, just as generations of my family had done before them. Years have passed since that night during the renovation, but the memory remains as vivid as the Irish mist that clings to the Kerry Hills at dawn. The farmhouse still stands, renewed yet unchanged in its essence. The exposed secrets have been carefully documented, the weapons turned over to proper authorities, and the personal artifacts preserved for future generations. But some things, the most important things, remain wonderfully, hauntingly unexplainable. The front door, now restored and properly hung, opens smoothly on well-oiled hinges. Modern convenience has replaced much of the old-world charm, yet there's something about the house that renovation couldn't touch, couldn't modernize. The footsteps still echo through the halls on certain nights, though they're different now, less frequent perhaps, but more purposeful when they do come. I've come to understand that in this corner of Ireland, where the old ways still whisper, through the gaps in modern life, there's a different kind of truth. It's not the stark, clean-edged truth I knew in New York, but something more fluid, more alive. The line between memory and reality, between the physical and the supernatural, isn't as clear as we might think. My grandmother Mary's stories, which once seemed designed merely to frighten and entertain, now reveal themselves as something far more significant, a way of preserving not just history, but the very soul of a place and its people. Every tale she told, every superstition she passed down, was another thread in the tapestry that connected us to this land, to this house, to each other. My grandfather, too, lives on in ways I never expected, sometimes in dreams that feel more real than memories. I see him clearly. He's not the elderly man I knew in my childhood, but the young farmer turned freedom fighter, moving through the house with purpose, protecting secrets that would shape a nation. These dreams don't feel like mere products of imagination. They're more like visitations, moments when the veil between past and present grows thin enough to touch. The 14 souls who passed through that front door to their final rest, the countless fighters who found sanctuary within these walls, the generations of my family who lived and loved and struggled here, they're all part of the house now. Their stories are written in its stones, their footsteps embedded in its floorboards, their whispers caught in the spaces between walls. I still don't call myself a believer in ghosts, not in the traditional sense, but I've learned that there are different kinds of hauntings. Some are born of tragedy or unfinished business, but others, like ours, are born of love, of duty, of the deep connection between a family and the place they call home. The footsteps that still walk our halls aren't a sign of restless spirits, but of faithful guardians, still making their rounds, still watching over their own. The renovation revealed our family's secrets, but it also revealed something more profound. The unbreakable connection between past and present, between the physical and the spiritual, between the living and those who have passed on, but never truly left. The guns in the walls, the personal artifacts beneath the floorboards, the layers upon layers of wallpaper, each was a page in our family's story, a story that continues to be written. Today, when I visit the farmhouse, I no longer fear the sensation of being watched. Instead, I welcome it as a reminder that I'm never truly alone here. The prickling at the back of my neck, the sudden drops in temperature, the sound of footsteps in the night, these are just the house's way of remembering, of keeping alive the spirits of those who came before. And so our farmhouse stands, a bridge between worlds, between generations, between what we can explain and what we can only feel. The front door still opens for special occasions, but now we understand that it's not just a door, it's a threshold between past and present, between the world we can see and the one we can only sense. In sharing this story, I've done more than just preserve a family tale. I've kept alive a piece of old Ireland, a glimpse into a world where the veil between worlds is thin, where stories are more than just entertainment, and where the footsteps of the past continue to echo through the halls of the present. And perhaps, somewhere in that space between belief and skepticism, between memory and mystery, my grandparents are still making their rounds, still watching over their home, still keeping their eternal vigil. The summer air hung thick with honeysuckle as I sat cross-legged in our backyard, carefully arranging my collection of painted rocks into intricate patterns. At 6 years old, I had mastered the art of entertaining myself, a skill born from necessity rather than choice. The neighboring kids rarely ventured to our end of the street, and my mother worked long hours to keep our modest home afloat, leaving me to craft my own adventures in the confines of our fenced yard. That's when I first met John. I remember the moment with crystal clarity, the way the evening light slanted through our old maple tree, casting dappled shadows that danced across the grass. At first I thought he was a neighbor I hadn't met before, this tall figure with neatly slicked back white hair. He wore a crisp white t-shirt that seemed to catch the sunlight, making him stand out against the weathered fence behind him. Red, suspenders stretched over his broad shoulders, holding up worn blue jeans that ended in scuffed work boots. "Well, hello there, sweetheart," he said, his voice warm and gravelly, like autumn leaves crunching underfoot. "That's quite the collection you've got there. Most children are taught to fear strangers, but there was something about John that felt as familiar as my own reflection. Perhaps it was the gentle crinkles around his eyes when he smiled, or the way he knelt down to my level, showing genuine interest in my rock collection. Whatever it was, in that moment, I gained not just an imaginary friend, but a companion who would reshape my understanding of family bonds in ways I couldn't yet comprehend. Looking back now, I realized that what seemed like a simple childhood fantasy was the beginning of something far more extraordinary, a story that would take years to fully unravel, connecting past and present in ways that defy rational explanation. But to understand how it all came together, we need to start at the beginning, in that backyard where magic and reality blurred into something beautiful and mysterious. "Would you like to know a secret?" John asked, gesturing to an empty patch of soil near the fence. "I know just how to make apple trees grow right here. Would you like that?" I nodded eagerly, not knowing then that this was the first of many promises that would weave themselves into the fabric of my childhood memories. As the setting sun painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, I had no way of knowing that this seemingly simple encounter would eventually unlock doors to my family's past that had been closed for generations. The story I'm about to tell spans decades, crossing the boundaries between imagination and reality, between loss and discovery. It's a tale about how sometimes the most profound connections in our lives come disguised as simple childhood magic, and how the bonds of family can reach across time itself to find us when we need them most. The days with John took on a rhythm as natural as breathing. He would appear most often in the late afternoons, when the sun had softened its harsh summer glare and the world seemed to slow down. Each visit brought new discoveries, each conversation adding another thread to the tapestry of our friendship. "You see that robin over there?" he would say, pointing to a bird hopping across our yard. "Did you know they always come back to the same place every spring?" His knowledge seemed endless, especially about things that grew or built or lived outdoors. He spoke of wood grains and growth rings, of factory machines and forest paths, each story carrying the weight of lived experience. I learned that he had spent his life working with wood, first in a mill that smelled of fresh-cut pine and hummed, with the rhythm of saw blades, then in a factory where machines transformed raw lumber into finished pieces. "But this," he would say, gesturing to our shared moments in the yard, "this is much better than any day I ever spent working." The other adults in my life, my mother, my teachers, our neighbors, never seemed to notice John, but that didn't bother me. In the logic of childhood, it made perfect sense that he was mine alone to know. He became my secret keeper, my storyteller, my guide to the hidden wonders of our small corner of the world. Some days, we would sit in comfortable silence as I played, his presence as steady as the oak tree that shaded our yard. Other times, he would burst with enthusiasm over the smallest discoveries. "Ooh, sweetheart, come over here and see this rose," he would call out, his voice carrying the same excitement, whether it was the first or 100th bloom we'd examined together. But there were moments, brief flickers really, when a shadow would pass over his face. He would stare off into the distance, past our fence, past the neighborhood, towards something I couldn't see. In those moments, he seemed to carry a weight I couldn't understand, his usually bright eyes turning distant and thoughtful. "Do you ever think about just going?" he asked me once, as we watched clouds drift overhead. "Just getting in a car and driving until you find the perfect spot to stop?" I remember giggling at the idea. "Where would you go?" "Anywhere, everywhere." His smile returned, but it held something different now, a mixture of longing and determination. Sometimes, the best destination is the one you haven't planned. Looking back, I should have recognized these conversations as gentle preparation, subtle hints of what was to come. But children live in the eternal present, where tomorrow feels as distant as the stars, and goodbye is a concept too heavy to fully grasp. The seasons turned, marking our time together with falling leaves, winter frost, and spring renewals. John remained a constant, his red suspenders a bright flag of comfort in my world of childhood uncertainties. He never aged, never changed, while I grew taller and began to notice the way other people looked at me when I spoke to someone they couldn't. See? The day John said goodbye started like any other. The morning air had that peculiar crispness that signals the transition from summer to fall, and the maple leaves were just beginning to hint at their coming transformation. I was in the backyard, as usual, this time attempting to build a fairy house out of twigs and leaves. His appearance was different somehow, more solid, yet somehow more distant, like a radio station coming in clear but fading at the edges. The familiar red suspenders seemed brighter against his white shirt, and his work boots left no impressions in the dewy grass as he walked toward me. "Sweetheart," he said, his voice carrying a new note I had never heard before. "I need to tell you something important." I looked up from my fairy construction project, immediately sensing the shift in our usual dynamic. The air seemed to thicken with unspoken words, and even the birds had fallen silent. "It's time for me to be heading off," he continued, his words gentle but firm. "Where are you going?" I asked, my hands still clutching a small twig, the fairy house forgotten. He smiled that familiar smile, the one that always made his eyes crinkle, at the corners. I don't know exactly. I'm going to go get my car and drive until I feel like stopping. Maybe I'll build a house and settle down wherever I choose to stop. The way he said it made it sound like the greatest adventure anyone could imagine. And despite the hollow feeling growing in my chest, I found myself caught up in his enthusiasm. In my 6-year-old mind, it sounded like something from a storybook, a magical journey to an unknown destination. "Will you come back?" I asked. Though something in me already knew the answer, he knelt down to my level one last time, and for a moment I thought I saw tears in his eyes, though they might have been merely reflections of the morning sun. The thing about adventures, sweetheart, is that they take us to new places. But the memories we make, those stay with us forever. I watched as he walked toward the road, his figure somehow both sharp and ethereal against the morning light. He didn't fade away like a ghost in a story. He simply walked, step by step, until he reached the place where our yard met the street, and then he was gone. Years passed, and like many childhood memories, John began to take on the quality of a dream, something that felt real in the moment, but becomes harder to grasp the more you try to examine it. I grew up, started high school, and learned to navigate the world without my mysterious friend. But the story wasn't over. In fact, it was about to reveal its most extraordinary chapter. The photo album lay open on my Aunt Rita's coffee table, its pages heavy with the weight of history. My mother and I had driven straight here after getting the call, after finally locating the sister she'd been separated from at age 5. The air was charged with emotion as we sat there, 3 women connected by blood, but separated by decades of silence. Rita's fingers traced the edges of each photograph as she named our relatives. "This is our grandmother, Uncle Frank." Each name was a thread connecting us to a family tapestry we'd never known existed. The excitement in my mother's voice as she asked about our grandparents was palpable, raw with decades of wondering and waiting. Then came the photos of my grandfather, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. The first picture showed a younger man, but I knew that face. The next showed him a bit older, and my heart began to race. By the time we reached the photos from the 1970s, my hands were trembling. There he was, the white hair slicked back just so, the familiar white t-shirt, and those red suspenders I had known so well. What was his name? I managed to ask, though I already knew the answer would shatter my understanding of reality. "John Jackson," Rita replied, and the room seemed to spin around me. I struggled to maintain my composure as memories crashed over me like waves. John showing me how to spot robins' nests, explaining the different types of clouds, promising to grow apple trees in our yard. Each memory suddenly took on new weight, new meaning. He hadn't been an imaginary friend at all. He had been my grandfather, reaching across time to know the grandchild he would never meet in life. Rita must have noticed something in my expression, because she paused, studying my face. "You remind me so much of him," she said softly. "He was always so kind and adventurous." "Yes," I whispered. "I love adventures. I love going on trips." The words tumbled out before I could stop them. Rita's eyes lit up. "You got a lot of his blood in you. He was funny too. He used to tell us he was going to get in his sports car and drive, and wherever he stopped, he was going to build a house and live there." In that moment, everything connected, past and present, reality and what I had thought was imagination. The goodbye that had seemed like the end of a childhood fantasy had been something else entirely. A grandfather's spirit, having completed his mission to know and love. His grandchild, finally taking that long-promised journey, as I sat there in my aunt's living room, surrounded by the physical evidence of a family I never knew I had. I understood that some bonds transcend the ordinary boundaries of time and space. My grandfather, unable to meet me in life, had found another way to be present for his granddaughter. He had given me not just companionship when I needed it most, but also a connection to my family's past that would have otherwise been lost to time. The story of John, my grandfather, my friend, my guardian spirit, taught me that love finds a way to bridge any gap, even the seemingly impossible one between life and death. In those childhood moments in our backyard, magic and reality had merged to create something extraordinary, a relationship that defied explanation but was as real as the photographs now spread before me, as real as the tears of recognition rolling down my cheeks. Some might call it impossible. This story of a grandfather's love reaching across the boundaries of time to touch the life of a lonely child. But I know the truth. Sometimes the most real things in life are the ones that can't be explained, only felt in the heart and carried forward in memory, like the echo of footsteps in an empty hallway or the lingering warmth of a summer afternoon, spent in the company of someone who was never really imaginary at all.